Welcome. Find a comfortable position. Perhaps you have been lying here for a few minutes already, adjusting things, getting the blanket right, deciding which side of the pillow is the cooler side, and whether that is the side you want facing you tonight. Perhaps the room is the right kind of dark. Perhaps there are small sounds from somewhere in the house or outside, the settling kind of sounds that a building makes when the day is done, the sounds that are familiar enough to be reassuring rather than intrusive. That is good. That is exactly the right kind of start to a night. There is nothing you need to do. There is nowhere you need to be. There is only this quiet story about people who lived a very long time ago in wooden buildings on the edge of the sea or deep in cold forests or beside wide grey rivers, who woke up each morning and did the same things they had done the morning before, and who were, for the most part, not especially remarkable people doing not especially remarkable things, and whose lives, described carefully and at a slow pace in the late quiet of the evening, are exactly the right kind of material for the mind that is trying to stop spinning and settle and let sleep come in. This is a story about Viking villages, not about the raids, because raids are exciting, and exciting is not what we are here for. Not about the longships setting out across stormy water, because those too carry a kind of drama that wakes the mind rather than quieting it. We are here for what was happening on the shore while the ships were away. We are here for the people who stayed in the village and kept it running, who got up in the cold dark of a Scandinavian morning and lit the fire and began another day of making things and mending things and feeding animals and cooking food and talking to their neighbours about the same things they had talked about the day before. We are here for the texture of a life that was ordinary in its time, that followed the same rhythms year after year and generation after generation, that was shaped by the same forces of cold and darkness and work and seasonal change that shape any life lived close to the ground and close to the weather. So let us begin in the same way that a Viking morning always began, which was with the fire. Chapter 1. The Longhouse. The Longhouse was the central building of Viking domestic life, and understanding what it was like to live in one is the starting point for understanding what everyday life in a Viking village actually felt like, which is different from what popular imagination suggests it felt like, in the same way that most things in history are different from their popular image, once you examine them closely and calmly. A Viking longhouse was, as its name suggests, long. A typical longhouse might be 15 to 30 metres in length, and some were longer, the length depending on the wealth and status of the family that lived in it and on the number of people and animals the building needed to shelter. The width was more consistent, typically around 5 to 7 metres, because the technique of roof construction placed limits on how wide a building could be spanned with the available timber. The walls of the longhouse were built of whatever materials were available locally. In Scandinavia, where timber was plentiful, the walls were often made of wood, either planks or wattle and daub, which was a framework of woven sticks covered with a mixture of clay, dung and straw that dried hard and provided reasonable insulation. In areas where stone was more available than timber, stone walls were used, sometimes with turf piled against the outside to improve insulation. In Iceland, where timber was very scarce, buildings were made almost entirely of turf, the thick slabs of grass-rooted earth providing excellent insulation against the extreme cold, and the buildings blended into the landscape so thoroughly that from a distance they could be mistaken for natural hillocks. The roof was the most technically demanding part of the longhouse. It was constructed on a framework of heavy timber posts, with the ridgeline supported by 2 rows of internal posts running the length of the building. These posts divided the interior into 3 sections, a central aisle and 2 side aisles, the central aisle being the highest part of the building and the side aisles lower, where the roof sloped down toward the walls. The roof was covered with thatch or with turf, both of which were effective at keeping rain out and warmth in, and both of which required periodic maintenance, the thatch needing to be replaced when it rotted, and the turf needing to be managed to prevent it from becoming too heavy or developing structural problems. The floor of the longhouse was typically the earth itself, packed hard by use, sometimes covered with a layer of straw or rushes that could be swept out and replaced when it became dirty. Along the inner walls of the side aisles, there were raised wooden platforms, perhaps 1/2 meter high and 1 meter or more wide, which served as benches during the day and as sleeping places at night. These platforms were the beds of the household, and the people of the household slept on them on straw mattresses or on animal skins or on folded wool, covered by whatever they had in the way of blankets and cloaks, not in private rooms, but together in the shared space of the building, all of them within sight and hearing of each other, the children and the adults and the servants and the occasional animals that needed to be kept inside in particularly cold weather. In the centre of the longhouse, running along the length of the central aisle, was the hearth. This was not a hearth in a fireplace with a chimney in the way that modern people understand a hearth. It was an open fire in the middle of the floor, contained in a low stone or clay surround, burning wood or peat, the smoke rising to a hole in the roof above it, or simply finding its way out through the gaps in the thatch as best it could. The management of the smoke was imperfect, and a Viking longhouse in winter with the fire going was a smoky place, the upper parts of the building filled with a haze that the inhabitants had long since stopped noticing, their eyes having adapted to it and their lungs having accommodated to the chronic presence of wood smoke in the air they breathed. This sounds uncomfortable by modern standards, but by the standards of the time and the alternatives available, the longhouse with its central fire was warm and bright and functional, and the smoke was simply part of the condition of being warm and inside. Chapter 2. The Morning. The morning in a Viking village began when the light began, or before it, because the fire needed to be kept going, and the animals needed to be tended, and there was always work waiting for whoever was awake enough to start it. The Norse had a word for the period before dawn, the time when the sky was beginning to lighten but the sun had not yet appeared, and this word was used in a way that suggests the period was considered neither fully night nor fully day, a transitional time when the work of the day was beginning but the world had not yet fully committed to being awake. The first person to wake in the longhouse would typically be the woman of the household, who was responsible for the management of the domestic domain, which was the centre of Viking economic life. She would rise from the sleeping platform, put on her outer garments and go to the hearth. If the fire had gone out overnight, which it tried not to do but sometimes did. It needed to be relit from whatever embers remained, which was done by blowing gently on the coals and adding small pieces of dry wood or dried moss until the flame caught and could be built up carefully to a proper fire. If the fire was still going, it needed to be fed, the remaining coals banked up and fresh fuel added to bring it back to a useful cooking heat. The making of the morning fire was a skill that was practiced every day for a lifetime, and the person who did it with the particular efficiency of deep familiarity, knowing exactly how much air the coals needed and how much fuel to add and in what order. The hands moving through the process without requiring direction from the mind perhaps still partly in the state of the night, and partly already considering the first tasks of the day, while the hands manage the fire on their own. This is a very pleasant state to imagine, the semi-wakefulness of the early morning, the warm light of the fire beginning to fill the longhouse, the silence of the sleeping village outside. With the fire going, the morning preparation of food could begin. The main morning food was typically porridge, made from grain, usually barley or oats, cooked in a pot over the fire with water. The pot was a large clay or iron vessel that sat on the fire or was suspended above it on a chain or a tripod, and the grain was added to the water and stirred occasionally as it cooked, which took a certain amount of time that was occupied with the other early morning tasks that needed to be done before the household was fully awake and needing its breakfast. The animals were one of the most pressing early morning concerns. Vikings kept livestock, primarily cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and horses, and in the cold months of the year, some or all of these animals were kept inside or in outbuildings very close to the longhouse, because the cold was too severe for them to survive outdoors. The animals needed to be fed and watered every morning, and they needed their bedding managed, the soiled straw removed and replaced with clean, which was not a pleasant task but was a necessary one, and was done with the same methodical efficiency as everything else in the early morning routine. By the time the animals had been tended, and the porridge was cooked and the other members of the household were stirring on their sleeping platforms, the morning was properly underway. The longhouse warm and smelling of fire and food and the particular domestic smell of a space that was lived in intensively by people and animals, a smell that was entirely familiar to its inhabitants, and that was simply the smell of home. Chapter 3. The Layout of the Village. A Viking village was not a planned settlement in any formal sense. It grew organically, buildings appearing where they were needed and where the ground allowed, connected by paths that were worn into the earth by repeated use, rather than by any deliberate surveying. The result was a collection of buildings of various sizes clustered together in a way that reflected the practical needs of the people who lived there, rather than any abstract principle of organization. The longhouse of the leading family or the chieftain was typically the largest building in the village, not dramatically larger, but enough larger to signal the difference in status. Around it were the longhouses of the other families, smaller in proportion to their owners' standing, and associated with each longhouse were the outbuildings that the household required. A storage building for food and tools, a barn for the animals, perhaps a separate smithy if the household had the equipment and the skill for ironworking, Perhaps a small building that served as a bathhouse, because the Norse bathed more regularly than their reputation in popular history sometimes suggests. The bathhouse, called a badstuga, or a similar name in various Norse languages, was a small building with a hearth and stones that were heated by the fire, and water was poured over the hot stones to create steam, and the people of the household would sit in the steam to wash themselves and to warm themselves in the deep cold of winter. This was a weekly practice in many households, a regular part of the domestic routine, and the bathhouse was a familiar and well-used building whose small warmth was a particular comfort in the long cold of a Scandinavian winter. The village as a whole was oriented toward whatever natural feature defined it. A harbour if the village was coastal, a river if it was on a waterway, a clearing in the forest if it was an inland settlement. The buildings were arranged to take advantage of the site and to minimize the exposure to the prevailing wind, which in the coastal villages of Scandinavia could be very strong and very cold, and which the longhouse's thick walls and low profile were well designed to resist. The doors of the longhouses faced away from the wind where possible, and the arrangement of buildings sometimes created sheltered spaces between them where people could stand and talk without the wind pulling their words away. The paths between buildings were narrow and muddy in wet weather, and dusty in dry weather, and frozen hard in winter, and they were lined with the incidental accumulation of village life. The wood piles and the tool racks and the fishing nets hung to dry, and the boats pulled up above the tide line, and the various other objects that needed to be stored somewhere, and for which outside was as good as anywhere. The village looked, in other words, exactly like what it was, a place where people lived and worked, and kept all the equipment that living and working required, arranged according to practical logic and accumulated habit, rather than according to any plan. Chapter 4. Food and its preparation. Food in a Viking village was the product of a combination of farming, fishing, hunting and gathering, and the particular combination depended on where the village was and what resources it had access to. A coastal village ate a great deal of fish. An inland village relied more heavily on their products of farming and the forest. But all Viking communities shared a common reliance on certain staple foods, and the preparation of those foods was a major component of daily domestic labour. Grain was central. Barley was the most widely grown grain in Scandinavia, partly because it could be grown further north than wheat, and partly because it could be used for both bread and for ale, which was the drink of everyday life in Viking settlements. Oats were also grown and eaten. The grain was stored in large quantities after the harvest to last through the winter, kept in dry buildings in sacks or in sealed containers to protect it from moisture and from mice, and it was drawn on through the year, ground into flour for bread and cooked into porridge, the quantity used each day carefully considered in relation to what remained and how long the winter still had to run. The grinding of grain was done on a hand quern, which was a stone grinding mill consisting of two circular stones, the lower one fixed and the upper one turned by hand. The grain fed through a hole in the upper stone and emerging as flour around the edges of the lower stone. Grinding grain on a quern was slow and physically demanding work, requiring both arms and a steady rotary motion, maintained for as long as the grinding took, which could be a considerable time if the household needed enough flour for a day's baking. Many Viking household sites have been excavated with quernstones among the artifacts, and the worn condition of many of these stones speaks of the hundreds or thousands of hours of grinding that took place over their lifetimes. Bread was baked on a flat stone set over the fire, or in a simple clay oven, producing flatbreads of various thicknesses depending on how much leavening was used and how hot the baking surface was. Viking bread was generally denser and coarser than modern bread, made from whole grain flour that retained the bran and the germ rather than being refined, and it had a strong flavour that was simply the flavour of bread to the people who ate it, because they had no other standard of comparison. The bread was nutritious and filling and was eaten at most meals, sometimes with butter or with fat or with whatever was available to make it more palatable. Meat came from the domestic animals, primarily cattle and sheep and pigs, and from hunting, which provided deer and elk and wild boar and various smaller animals, and from the sea and the rivers and the lakes, which provided fish in great quantities. Fish was particularly important because it could be preserved more easily than meat, dried in the wind and the cold of the Scandinavian climate to produce stockfish, which was cod-dried without salt until it was as hard as a board, and which would keep for months or even years and could then be reconstituted by soaking in water. Stockfish was a staple of the Viking diet in the way that bread was, a reliable and durable food that was always available and that sustained the population through the periods when fresh food was not. The preservation of food was a major preoccupation of the Viking household, because the winter was long and the growing season was short, and the difference between having enough preserved food and not having enough was very consequential. Meat was smoked and salted and dried. Fish was dried or fermented. Dairy products, the milk of the cows and goats, were made into cheese and skyr, which was a thick fermented dairy product similar to yogurt, both of which lasted longer than fresh milk. Vegetables and berries and fruits were preserved where possible by drying or by storage in cold conditions. The whole enterprise of food preservation was a seasonal intensification of the ongoing domestic work, with the autumn being the most critical period, when the harvest was brought in and the animals that were not going to be kept through the winter were slaughtered and their meat processed in various ways for the months ahead. Chapter 5. Textile work. If there was a single activity that characterized the indoor life of Viking women more than any other, it was textile work. The production of cloth, from the preparation of the raw fibre through the spinning of yarn and the weaving of fabric to the cutting and sewing of garments, was a continuous domestic occupation that occupied a significant portion of every day throughout the year. The Vikings needed cloth for their clothing, for their bedding, for their sails, for their many other textile needs, and all of this cloth was produced by hand in the household, by the women of the household and such help as they had. The process began with the raw material. Wool from the sheep was shorn in late spring, sorted by quality, and cleaned by washing to remove the lanolin and the dirt. The cleaned wool was then combed or carded with small paddles bearing rows of metal teeth, which aligned the fibres parallel to each other and produced a soft, fluffy preparation called a rolag that was ready for spinning. The combing or carding was a task that could be done while sitting by the fire in the evening, the hands working automatically through the familiar motions while attention was given to the conversation of the household. The two activities compatible in a way that more demanding tasks were not. Spinning was done with a drop spindle, which was a simple tool consisting of a straight stick with a weighted disc near one end called a whirl. The prepared wool fibres were drawn out from the olag and attached to the spindle, which was then set spinning with a twist of the fingers and allowed to drop, its weight pulling the fibres downward and the spinning motion twisting them together into yarn. The spinner would feed the fibres from the prepared rolag with one hand while managing the drop of the spindle with the other, the spindle spiralling downward through the air, stretching and twisting the yarn as it fell until it was near the floor and needed to be wound up onto the stick before being set spinning again. This up and down rhythm of the drop spindle, the rise of the hand drawing out the fibres and the fall of the spindle twisting them together, was one of the most constant rhythmic movements in the Viking longhouse. The spinner's hands never quite still, the spindle never quite resting, the yarn accumulating on the stick in a slow but continuous way. Weaving was done on a large loom, typically a warp-weighted loom, which was a simple but effective device consisting of two upright posts with a crossbar from which the warp threads hung down vertically, weighted at their lower ends by small clay or stone rings that kept them under tension. The weaver stood at the loom and passed the weft thread horizontally through the warp threads, alternating which warp threads were in front and which behind to create the interlacing pattern that is the fundamental structure of all woven cloth. The process was methodical and slow, and required continuous attention to keep the tension even and the pattern consistent, and a wide piece of cloth could take many days or weeks to complete on a warp-weighted loom. The loom stood in a prominent position in the longhouse, often near the door where the light was best, and the weaving was one of the most visible of the domestic activities. The rhythmic sound of the beater, which was a flat board used to pack the weft threads tightly together, was a familiar sound of the longhouse interior, a regular thud that marked the passage of each weft row, and that became, over years of hearing it in the same building, simply part of the acoustic texture of home. Sewing, once the cloth was woven, produced the garments and other items that the household needed. Viking clothing was simple in construction but well made, sewn with linen thread through wool or linen fabric in small, even stitches using a bone or iron needle. The basic garment for men was a tunic, knee-length or longer, worn with trousers. Women wore a longer dress, often with an overdress pinned at the shoulders with oval brooches that were among the most characteristic pieces of Viking material culture, and that were objects of some pride, made of bronze or silver, and sometimes decorated with intricate patterns. The production and care of these garments was another ongoing component of the textile work that never fully ceased. Chapter 6: Ironworking and Crafts. Not all of the village's productive work was done indoors or by women. The men of the village were occupied with a range of crafts and activities that were equally essential to the community's well-being, and that had their own rhythms and their own particular demands. Chief among the skilled crafts was ironworking, which in a Viking village was typically carried out in a small separate building. The smithy, positioned away from the longhouse because of the fire risk and because the noise and heat of the forge were not compatible with the domestic space. The Viking smith worked with iron ore that was extracted from bog iron, a form of iron found in the waterlogged soils of many Scandinavian landscapes. Bog iron was not particularly high-quality iron, but it was available in quantities large enough to supply the local demand for iron tools and fittings, and the skill of the smith could transform this modest raw material into objects of considerable quality. The process of making iron from bog iron began with smelting, which was the heating of the ore in a furnace to separate the iron from the slag, a process that required sustained high temperatures and careful management of the airflow through the furnace, controlled by the smith using a bellows. The smelted iron, called bloom iron, was worked at the forge by heating it to a bright orange or yellow heat, and then hammering it on the anvil to shape it and to consolidate the metal and drive out remaining impurities. The hammering was rhythmic and sustained, the smith working the hot metal quickly before it cooled, because iron that had cooled below a certain temperature became brittle and resisted the hammer rather than responding to it. The sound of hammering in the smithy was one of the characteristic sounds of a working village, carrying across the other sounds of the settlement in the clear air of morning or late afternoon, the regular metallic ringing of hammer on iron on anvil that had its own cadence and its own rhythm, quite distinct from the sounds of the domestic space. The objects that the Viking smith produced were the objects that the community needed. Axe heads, knife blades and arrowheads for the practical and the military, tools for farming and carpentry and the other crafts, nails and rivets and clamps and hasps for construction and joinery, hooks and chains and cauldron fittings for the kitchen. Some smiths also worked in bronze and in silver, producing the brooches and rings and armbands that were both personal ornaments and a form of portable wealth in the Viking world. The quality of the smiths' work was a matter of community pride and personal reputation, and the good smith was valued and respected in a way that reflected the genuine importance of their skill. Woodworking was another essential craft. The buildings of the village, the boats, the furniture of the longhouse, the tools of farming and fishing, the sledges and the carts, all required skilled woodwork, and the carpenter who could produce these things with precision and durability was an indispensable member of the community. Viking woodworking used a range of tools, axes of various sizes, adzes, saws, augers for boring holes, planes and chisels, and the craftsperson who worked with these tools knew each one's particular character and had adapted their technique to suit the specific wood they were working with, because different woods behave differently under the tool, and the skilled carpenter knew these differences from long experience. Boat building was the most demanding and most prestigious of the woodworking crafts, and in a coastal Viking community the boat builder occupied a central role. The construction of a longship or a nar, which was the broader-beamed merchant vessel that carried goods between trading ports, required months of careful work, the selection of the right timber for each component, the shaping of the planks and strakes to the right curves, the assembly of the hull in the clinker-built style that was characteristic of Norse boat construction, with each plank overlapping the one below it, and the whole being held together by iron rivets. A well-built Viking vessel was a thing of considerable beauty and considerable utility, and the boat builder who produced it demonstrated a mastery of materials and technique that took years to acquire. Chapter 7. The Social Life of the Village. The social life of a Viking village was centred on the longhouse, and specifically on the communal fire and the evening meal. The longhouse was not simply a domestic space in the narrow sense, but a social space where the business of the community was conducted, where disputes were aired and resolved, where guests were received and entertained, where stories were told and songs were sung, and where the accumulated social knowledge of the community was maintained and transmitted. The evening meal was the main meal of the day, and was prepared and eaten in a more deliberate and social way than the quick morning porridge. The preparation of the evening meal could take several hours, involving the cooking of meat if it was available, the baking of bread, the preparation of whatever vegetables and dairy products were to be served, and the setting out of the wooden bowls and the knives and the wooden spoons that the household used for eating. The household ate together, seated along the sleeping platforms on either side of the central hearth, the fire giving both warmth and light, the food passed along from person to person in the communal way of a household that lived together in a single space. After the meal, the evening was the time for the social activities of the community. Neighbours might come in, or the household might go to a neighbour's longhouse, the village's social life flowing between the buildings in the informal way of communities where everyone is within easy walking distance of everyone else, and where the formalities of announced visits and scheduled entertainment do not yet exist. The conversation of the evening would cover the practical matters of the day and the week, what work had been done and what remained, how the animals were doing, what the weather suggested about the coming days, whether the fishing had been good, and it would also cover the wider news that reached the village through the travellers and traders who passed through, news from other settlements, from the wider Norse world, from the distant places that the traders had been. Stories were a central part of evening entertainment. The Norse tradition of storytelling was rich and detailed, and the stories that were told in the longhouses of Viking villages were not simple tales, but elaborate narratives with complex characters and intricate plots. The sagas that would eventually be written down in the medieval Icelandic tradition, but that for centuries before that were oral, carried in the memories of the storytellers and of the audiences who heard them, and who would in turn tell them to their own children. The storyteller in the Viking longhouse was performing from memory, shaping the narrative in real time, responding to the audience, and the story would vary in its details from one telling to the next, while maintaining the same essential structure and the same essential truth. Music was also part of the evening entertainment. The Norse played lyres and harps and flutes and various percussion instruments, and the music of the longhouse was the music of people making it themselves, for their own enjoyment and for the pleasure of the people around them. The Norse also had a tradition of flighting, which was a form of competitive verbal exchange in which two people traded insults or challenges in a formal way, demonstrating verbal dexterity and the ability to think quickly and wittily. Flighting was a form of entertainment as well as a social contest, and the ability to hold your own in a flighting was a matter of some pride. The games of the evening included board games, and archaeological evidence confirms that Viking communities played games on boards with pieces, games that combined strategy and luck in ways that kept people engaged through the long winter evenings. The games were played on boards of wood or carved in other materials, with pieces of carved bone or antler or glass, and the evidence of gaming pieces at archaeological sites from across the Norse world suggests that games were a widely shared form of entertainment, not limited to the wealthy. Chapter 8. Children in the Viking Village. Children in a Viking village were not kept apart from the adult world of work and responsibility in the way that modern children are, but were brought into it early and gradually, learning the skills they would need as adults by participating in adult activities from a young age. A child of 5 or 6 would already be contributing to the household work in small ways, carrying water or feeding animals or helping to prepare food, not because childhood was considered unimportant, but because the household needed all the help it could get, and because participation in the work was the best way to learn it. The learning happened by observation and by doing. A girl learning to spin would watch her mother and the other women of the household for a period, watching how the fibres were drawn out and how the spindle was set spinning and how the yarn was wound. And then she would try it herself, producing at first a lumpy and inconsistent yarn, and gradually through practice and correction and more practice, producing something that approached the regularity of the experienced spinner. There were no formal lessons. These skills transferred from one generation to the next through proximity and imitation and patient correction, the same method by which most skills transferred in the Viking world. Boys learned the outdoor skills of fishing and farming and craftsmanship in the same way, by following the men of the household and watching and eventually participating. A boy of 8 or 10 might go out fishing with his father or his older brothers, learning the handling of the boat and the reading of the water and the setting and checking of the nets, all of it acquired through doing rather than through instruction. By the time the boy was a young man, he would have several years of practical experience behind him, experience that was in many ways more valuable than any formal education, because it was the experience of the actual work in the actual conditions that he would face as an adult. The toys and games of Viking children are known partly through archaeology and partly through the written sources from a slightly later period, and they included carved wooden figures of animals and ships, small tools and implements that mirrored the adult versions, spinning tops, and the various outdoor games of running and jumping and throwing that children play in any culture in any period. Children also played in the natural environment that surrounded the village, the woods and the shores and the water, which provided an inexhaustible range of things to explore and to play with in the particular unsupervised way of children in small communities where everyone is known and the dangers of the environment are familiar and manageable. Chapter 9. Animals and their care. The animals of the Viking village were not separate from human life in the way that farm animals often are today, kept in distant fields and managed by machinery, but were immediate and present, sharing the physical space of the settlement and requiring daily personal attention. The relationship between the Viking farmer and their animals was one of close and continuous contact, and the welfare of the animals was a matter of genuine concern because the animals were assets whose loss or deterioration had direct consequences for the household's ability to feed itself. Cattle were the most valuable of the domestic animals. A cow provided milk through the summer, which was consumed fresh and made into butter and cheese and skyr for the winter. The calf born each spring was either raised as a future milking cow or bull, or slaughtered in the autumn when its value as a meat animal was at its maximum, the decision depending on the household's needs and the quality of the individual animal. The care of cattle was continuous, involving daily milking of the cows, the management of the pasture, the maintenance of the barn where they sheltered in winter, and the constant observation of their condition that allowed the farmer to notice illness or injury early and to respond before a small problem became a serious one. Sheep were kept for their wool and for their meat and for their milk, and sheep management required the annual cycle of shearing in late spring, the management of the lambing in early spring, the movement of the flocks between different grazing areas according to the season, and the selection of which animals to keep and which to slaughter. The Norse had a particular word for the autumn slaughter, and it was a significant event in the agricultural calendar, not something distressing but something necessary and organized. The killing and processing of the animals that had been raised through the summer with exactly this purpose in view. Horses were kept for transport and for status. A horse was a significant investment, and the care of horses was correspondingly careful. The Norse also had strong feelings about horses as animals, strong enough that horse meat was a food with ritual significance in the pre-Christian period, associated with sacrifices to the gods, and the prohibition of horse meat that came with Christianity was one of the aspects of the new religion that required the most adjustment in Scandinavian communities. A good horse was an object of genuine pride and was treated accordingly, well fed and well housed and well maintained, because a horse that was in poor condition could not do the work it was kept for, and because the investment it represented was too great to risk through neglect. Pigs were the most efficient converters of waste food to meat, and every household kept a few pigs if it could, feeding them on the scraps and the surplus of the kitchen and the dairy. Pigs required less management than cattle or horses, and could be kept in a small enclosed area near the longhouse, and their meat was preserved more easily than the meat of larger animals, the fat and the flesh being smoked or salted, without the practical difficulties that a whole cow presented. The pig slaughter in autumn was part of the same season of food preservation that included the cattle slaughter and the fish drying and the grain storage, all of it aimed at the same goal of having enough to eat through the long winter. Chapter 10. Fishing was central to Viking subsistence, and not only in the coastal communities. The rivers and lakes of the Norse lands were full of fish, particularly salmon and trout, and the inland communities that had access to these waterways made extensive use of them. But it was the sea fishing that was the largest scale and most important, and the coastal Viking communities developed fishing techniques and fishing equipment that were closely related to the seafaring technology for which the Norse are better known. The boats used for fishing were smaller than the longships, but built on the same principles. Clinker built from overlapping planks, flexible and seaworthy, and light enough to be launched and hauled up by a small crew. A typical fishing boat might be worked by 2 or 3 people, with nets or with lines depending on the target fish and the conditions. The nets were made from plant fibre, nettle or flax, hand-knotted in the particular mesh pattern that the target fish required, the mesh size matching the size of the fish being caught. The making of nets was itself a significant domestic craft, and the repair of nets was a constant task, tears and wear being addressed whenever there was time, the net maker's fingers moving through the familiar knotting sequence with the automatic ease of long practice. The fishermen of a Viking coastal village had detailed knowledge of the sea in the vicinity of their settlement, the location of the shoals, the movement of the currents, the relationship between the tides and the fishing, the signs in the weather that indicated what the sea was going to do. This knowledge was accumulated over lifetimes and passed down through families and through the community, and it was practical knowledge of the most direct kind, the kind that was tested every time the boat went out, and that had consequences when it was wrong. The catching of fish was followed by the processing of fish, which was as important as the catching, and which required its own knowledge and its own labour. Fish destined for immediate consumption were cleaned and cooked simply, grilled or boiled. Fish destined for preservation were split and hung to dry in the wind and the cold, which in the Norwegian climate was highly effective, or were smoked over a slow fire of green wood and peat, the smoke flavour becoming part of the food as the preservation happened. Herring, which was caught in enormous quantities during the seasonal runs, was also preserved by salting, packed in barrels with layers of salt between the fish, which kept it edible for months. The seasonal nature of fishing meant that certain periods of the year were periods of intense activity, when everyone who could be spared from other tasks was involved in the fishing, the net setting and the boat launching and the processing, all happening at once in the concentrated we of people who know that the season is short and that what is caught now must last until the next season. The rest of the year was quieter, the daily fishing providing fresh food but in smaller quantities, the store of dried and smoked and salted fish providing the reliable background that fresh fishing supplemented rather than replaced. Chapter 11. The Seasons. The rhythm of the Viking year was inseparable from the rhythm of the seasons, which in Scandinavia were more extreme in their contrast than in most of the places where this story might be heard. The winter was long and dark and cold in ways that shaped everything about how people lived, and the summer was brief and bright and productive in ways that made it feel precious and that demanded that every available hour of it be used. Spring and autumn were transitions between these extremes, each with their own particular demands and their own particular character. Winter was the long indoor season, the time of firelight and textile work and storytelling, the time when the pace of outdoor activity slowed to the minimum necessary for survival, and the social life of the longhouse intensified to fill the space that outdoor work had occupied. The days were very short, and in the northern parts of Scandinavia, in the region above the Arctic Circle, the sun did not rise at all for weeks at a time, and the darkness was complete except for the light of the fire and whatever candles or oil lamps the household had. The winter darkness was simply a condition of life, managed by the fire and by the warmth of the community gathered around it, and the Norse attitude toward winter was one of acceptance and preparation rather than of resistance. Spring was the most eagerly awaited of the seasons, the return of light and warmth that meant the end of the confinement of winter and the beginning of the productive outdoor work that the summer required. Spring in a Viking village was a busy season. The ploughing and the sowing and the maintenance of fields and fences and buildings that had been deferred through the winter all coming due at once, the animals needing more careful management as they were brought out of their winter housing, the fishing season resuming, the boats that had been pulled up for the winter needing to be checked and repaired before they went back into the water. It was a season of renewal that the Norse celebrated with corresponding enthusiasm, and the festivals of spring had a quality of relief and release that reflected the genuine hardship of the winter they had come through. Summer was the season of abundance, when the days were very long, reaching 20 hours of daylight in the south and the full midnight sun in the north, and when the work of growing and fishing and travelling and trading all happened at once in the long light. The shortness of the growing season meant that nothing could be deferred. The ground had to be worked while it could be worked. The grain had to be sown and grown and harvested in the narrow window that the climate allowed. The fishing had to happen when the fish were there. The travel and trade had to happen while the weather and the seas were suitable. Summer was not a season of leisure for Viking people, but a season of intense and sustained activity, and the length of the days meant that the working day could extend from very early in the morning to very late in the evening without any shortage of light. Autumn was the season of harvest and preservation, the gathering in of everything that summer had produced in preparation for the winter that was approaching. The grain was harvested and threshed and stored. The animals were assessed and the decisions made about which would be kept through the winter and which slaughtered. The fish were dried and smoked and salted. The berries and the mushrooms and the other wild foods of the forest were gathered. The root vegetables were stored in pits or in cellars. The firewood and the peat for fuel were laid in against the months ahead. The autumn was, in some respects, the most anxious season, because everything done in autumn was done with the winter in view, and the quality of the preparation determined how comfortable or how difficult the coming months would be. Chapter 12. Religion and Belief. The religious life of a Viking village in the pre-Christian period was woven into the fabric of ordinary life in a way that made it less a separate activity and more a constant background. The Norse gods, Odin and Thor and Freya and the others of the Norse pantheon, were not distant or abstract presences but active forces in the world, concerned with and involved in the lives of the people who worship them, and the practices of Norse religion were domestic and practical, rather than conducted in dedicated temples by a separate priestly class. The household had its own religious observances, small acts of propitiation and thanks directed at the spirits of the home and the land spirits called land wights who inhabited the particular landscape where the village stood, and who needed to be kept in good relations if the farm was to prosper. These were not elaborate ceremonies, but small gestures, the setting aside of a portion of food or drink as an offering, the careful avoidance of certain actions that might give offence to the spirits, the attention to certain signs and omens that the land wights communicated through the behaviour of animals and through the patterns of weather and nature. The larger religious observances happened at the seasonal festivals, which coincided with the transitions of the agricultural year, the beginning of winter and the beginning of summer and the midwinter point and others, and which involved the whole community in gatherings that combined religious ceremony with feasting and social activity. The blot, which was the Norse word for the sacrificial ritual, involved the killing of animals and the offering of their blood and flesh to the gods, and the subsequent feast in which the whole community shared the sacrificed animals was both a religious act and a communal one, the sharing of food as a form of community solidarity expressing something that went beyond the religious occasion. The gradual conversion of the Norse world to Christianity, which happened at different rates in different places between roughly 900 and 1100, did not immediately erase the older religious practices but layered new ones on top of them, and in many communities the two coexisted in a practical way for generations, people maintaining the domestic observances of the old religion while formally professing the new one. The adjustment was gradual and pragmatic rather than sudden and total, the old gods not so much rejected as quietly relegated to a different category, as Christianity became the dominant framework. Chapter 13. Trade and Visitors. The Viking village was not a closed community. It existed in a network of exchange and communication with other communities, both nearby and distant, and the arrival of traders and travellers was a regular occurrence that was anticipated and managed with a combination of hospitality and commercial interest that was characteristic of the Norse attitude toward strangers. The Norse were traders as well as raiders, and in many periods and many places the trading aspect of their interaction with the wider world was more significant than the raiding. The Norse trading network extended from the British Isles and Ireland in the west to the river routes of Russia in the east, and to the trading cities of the Byzantine Empire and the Arab world in the south, and the goods that moved through this network were various. Furs and amber and walrus ivory from the north, slaves from the raids, silver and spices and silk from the south and east. The village that was part of this network was connected through the movement of goods and of the people who carried them to a world that was very much larger than the immediate landscape. The trader who arrived at a Viking village brought news as much as goods. In a world without writing for ordinary communication, news travelled with the people who carried it, and a trader who had come from a distant place brought information about what was happening there that the village could not get any other way. The arrival of a trader was therefore an occasion for gathering and for information exchange as much as for commerce, and the evening spent in the longhouse with a visitor from afar, hearing their account of what they had seen and where they had been, was one of the more stimulating evenings in a village life that was otherwise consistent and settled in its rhythms. The hospitality given to visitors was a matter of genuine importance in Norse culture, a social obligation with both practical and religious dimensions. To turn away a visitor was to violate a fundamental norm, and the visitor who arrived in good faith was entitled to food and shelter for a period, to be received as a guest rather than as a stranger. The relationship between host and guest in the Norse world was one of the most clearly defined social relationships, with obligations on both sides, the host providing hospitality and the guest behaving in ways appropriate to a guest, not overstaying and not abusing the generosity offered. Chapter 14. The End of the Day. And now we arrive, as we always do in this kind of story, at the end of the day, which is the right place to arrive, because the end of the day is where we have been going all along, the point toward which all the work and the meals and the social life and the seasonal activity have been moving, not as a destination, but as a return. The daily return to the sleeping platform and the fire warmth and the particular darkness of the longhouse after the last lamp had been extinguished. The evening wound down in the way that evenings always wind down, gradually and without announcement, the conversation becoming slower and the pauses between contributions becoming longer, the people of the household becoming one by one quieter and stiller, the ones who were most tired settling back onto the sleeping platform first and drawing whatever cover they had over themselves and letting the warmth of the fire and the warmth of the other bodies in the enclosed space work together to produce the particular warmth of sleep. The fire was banked for the night, the embers piled together with fresh fuel placed carefully, so that they would continue to burn slowly through the hours of darkness and still be alive in the morning when the first person woke and needed to build it back up. The banking of the fire was a last task of the evening, done with care because a fire that went out entirely in the night was a cold morning and the difficult work of restarting from nothing, and a fire that burned too freely risked spreading in the confined and dry space of the longhouse. The banked fire, breathing very slowly in the night, producing just enough heat to keep the longhouse from becoming dangerously cold, was the household's link to the next morning, its slow combustion bridging the dark hours between the evening and the dawn. The longhouse in the night was full of the sounds of sleeping people and animals, breathing and turning, and the occasional small sounds of dogs or of livestock moving in their space. The fire gave off a faint orange light that was just enough to see shapes by, the sleeping forms on the platforms on either side of the central aisle, the hanging tools and the stored food and the loom standing in its corner, and the various objects of the household life arranged in the familiar disorder of things that are used and put down and used again without particular ceremony. The wind outside was whatever the wind was. In a coastal village it might be the sound of the sea, the continuous sound of water moving against the shore, which is a very old sound and a very consistent one, as regular and as indifferent as breathing, suggesting nothing and meaning nothing except that the sea is there and the shore is there and the world is continuing in its large and unhurried way. In an inland village it might be the sound of the forest, the movement of trees in a wind, which has its own rhythm and its own consistency, neither the same as the sea nor entirely different, another version of the sound of something very large being moved by something that does not notice it. The village outside the longhouse was still. The paths between the buildings were empty. The animals were in their buildings. The boats were pulled up on the shore or moored in the harbour, still now, not moving as they moved on the water. Everything that had been active through the long day was resting or maintaining the slow continuation of the banked fire that was a kind of rest, the minimum level of activity that kept the continuity going through the dark. And the people of the longhouse were sleeping, or very nearly sleeping, having come to the end of another day that was in most of its essentials the same as the day before and the day before that. A day of the same work in the same place with the same people, toward the same ends, and finding at the end of it the same rest, the same fire, the same warmth, the same drift into the dark that everyone and everything drifts into at the end of a day. You're doing the same thing, not in a Viking longhouse, and not in Scandinavia, and not 1,000 years ago, but the same essential thing, coming to the end of a day and lying down and letting the warmth and the dark do what they do, which is to receive you and to hold you and to carry you through the night hours to the other side, where the morning will be, when it comes, which it will, in its own time. It is not time yet. There is nothing to do yet. The fire is banked. The village is still. The sea or the forest is making its continuous sound outside, very steady, very reliable, asking nothing of you except that you rest inside the sound of it. Rest inside the sound of it. Let it carry you. The Viking village is sleeping. The longhouse is warm. The fire breathes slowly in the dark. Good night. A final note on the long dark. There is one more thing worth saying before we finish entirely, and it is something about the dark. The dark in a Viking winter was unlike any dark that most people in the modern world have experienced. In the northern parts of Norway and Sweden and Iceland, the sun does not rise at all for weeks in midwinter, and the sky during the day is at most a dim, grey twilight that passes for afternoon light for a few hours before returning to full dark. The people who lived in these places through these winters were living in a darkness that is difficult to fully imagine, a darkness that lasted not for a few hours of night, but for most of each 24 hours, day after day, week after week, and yet they lived in it. They managed it. They built their fires and lit their lamps and gathered in their warm buildings and told their stories and played their games and did their textile work and maintained the social life of the community through the long dark, because what else was there to do? The dark was not a catastrophe. It was not an emergency. It was simply the condition of winter in the north, as familiar to the people who lived there as anything else about their lives, and managed with the same practical acceptance that they brought to the other conditions of their lives. There is something in this acceptance that is worth carrying into your own dark, the dark of this night, which is a comparatively modest dark, a dark with central heating somewhere not far away, and the possibility of light at the touch of a switch, and the certainty of morning in a few hours. The Viking farmer who sat by their banked fire in the middle of a January that had not seen the sun for a month faced something considerably more demanding than the dark you're in, and managed it with a composure that came from understanding that the dark was not permanent, that the winter would end, that the light would return, and that in the meantime the fire was warm and the community was present, and the night would pass as nights always do. The night will pass. The fire is warm. The community, however distant, is present, and the dark is the same dark that the Viking farmer sat by their fire in. the same dark that has always been, the dark that is indifferent and patient and that holds everything equally and releases everything equally when the time comes. The time is not yet. Rest in the dark. Let the fire breathe. Let the village sleep around you, Viking and ancient and very far away, and yet somehow the same village that every human being has ever lived in, the same warmth and the same dark and the same end of the same kind of day. Good night. The fire is breathing, the sea is making its sound, the village is still, everything is as it should be. Sleep. Chapter 15. The Forge of the Smith. Let us return to the smithy and spend a little more time there, because the work of the smith was central enough to village life that it deserves more than a single mention, and because the details of the smith's daily work, described at the appropriate pace and in the appropriate order, have exactly the qualities that this kind of story requires. The smithy was a small building, typically a single room with an earthen floor, the forge along one wall, the bellows beside it, the anvil fixed to a heavy wooden block. In the centre of the floor and the various tools of the trade hanging on the walls or lying on the bench along the opposite side. The forge was a shallow stone or clay basin filled with charcoal, and air was forced through it from below by the bellows, which the smith or an assistant operated, pumping steadily to maintain the temperature necessary for iron to become workable. A working smithy had a very specific atmosphere. The heat from the forge was immediate and intense close to the fire, diminishing with distance but always present as a background warmth that made the smithy comfortable in winter and almost unbearably hot in summer. The smell was the smell of hot metal and hot coal, and the particular slightly acrid smell of iron scale falling from hot iron onto the floor, a smell that the smith had long since stopped noticing as a smell, and that was simply part of being in the smithy. The light was the light of the fire, supplemented by whatever came through the door or through any small window, and the shifting colour of the metal in the fire was itself a source of information for the smith, who learned to read the colour of the heated iron as a guide to its temperature and its readiness for working. The smith's workday began with the lighting of the forge. Cold charcoal needed to be brought to heat gradually, not rushed, because a forge fire that was ramped up too quickly produced uneven temperatures and wasted fuel. The smith would start with small pieces of dry wood to ignite the charcoal and then build the fire carefully, adding fuel and working the bellows in long, steady strokes, watching the colour of the fire change as it came to temperature. When the charcoal was burning with the bright orange core that indicated sufficient heat, the fire was ready. The first pieces of iron to be worked in the morning were put into the fire to heat, while the smith prepared the tools for the day's work. Each hammer had its purpose. The large hammer for the heavy, initial shaping, the smaller cross-peen hammer for drawing out the iron into longer shapes, the round-faced hammer for smoothing. The tongs that held the hot iron needed to be checked for their grip, because a piece of iron that slipped from the tongs when it was at forging temperature was a hazard that was not to be casually risked. The water trough in which hot iron was quenched to harden it was filled from the water supply. When the first piece of iron had reached the right temperature, which was indicated by its colour moving through red to orange to the bright yellow-orange that meant it was fully plastic and ready for working, The smith lifted it from the fire with the tongs and placed it on the anvil and began to hammer. The first strokes were heavy and deliberate, working the iron quickly while it was at its highest heat, shaping the basic form before the metal had cooled to the point where it resisted the hammer. The iron cooled as it was worked, the colour moving back from yellow to orange to red to black, and when it had cooled past the point of effective working, the smith returned it to the fire and began the cycle again. The making of a single iron object required multiple heat and work cycles, each one adding detail or refining the shape that the previous ones had established. A knife blade might require a dozen cycles or more, from the initial rough shaping of the bar into a blade-like form, through the drawing out of the edge, the establishing of the bevel, the straightening and the finishing. Each cycle was an opportunity to correct small deviations from the intended form, the smith's eye continuously assessing the work and directing the hammer to address whatever was not yet right. The finished object, when it was finally taken from the forge for the last time and quenched or allowed to cool slowly depending on the required properties, represented all of these accumulated small corrections and decisions, each one made quickly in the moment while the iron was at the right temperature. The smith worked through the morning in this rhythm of heating and hammering and returning to the fire, and the rhythm had a sound that carried through the village, the regular ringing of the hammer on the anvil punctuated by the whoosh of the bellows and the hiss of metal in the quench trough. It was a sound that the village had always known, that every member of the community had grown up hearing as part of the background of their world, as familiar and as unremarkable as the sound of the sea or the wind, the smith's hammer marking the day in its own way, as the church bells in a different kind of village marked the day in theirs. Chapter 16. The Making of a Boat. We have mentioned boat building as the most prestigious of the woodworking crafts, and it deserves a chapter of its own, because the process of building a Viking boat, described from beginning to end and in proper detail, is one of the most satisfying of all possible accounts of methodical skilled work, the kind of work that has a beginning and a middle and an end, and that produces something whole and useful and beautiful from raw materials that had none of those qualities. The first requirement for boat building was timber. The Norse boat builder preferred oak for the hull planking, because oak was strong and flexible and resisted the water, and the selection of suitable oak trees was the first step in the building process. The builder would go into the forest and look for trees of the right size and the right growth pattern, because the best planks for a boat hull were cleaved, meaning split along the grain of the wood rather than sawn across it, and cleaved planks required trees with very straight grain and without too many knots. The builder knew what they were looking for and could assess a standing tree with a practiced eye, circling it slowly, reading its character, deciding whether it would yield the timber the project required. The felled trees were first cleaved into blanks, large sections of the log split along the radial grain using wedges and wooden mallets and the weight of the log itself. The cleaving produced planks of remarkable strength and flexibility, because splitting along the grain preserved the long wood fibres that gave the plank its strength, in a way that sawing across them did not. The cleaved planks were then shaped with axes and adzes into the final dimensions. the builder working carefully along the length of each plank, removing material in controlled strokes, the adze blade biting into the wood and lifting a thin shaving with each stroke, the surface gradually becoming smoother and more regular. The construction of the hull began with the keel, which was the backbone of the vessel, a single long beam of wood that ran the full length of the boat from bow to stern. The keel was shaped from a single piece of timber where possible, because joints in the keel were potential weak points, and the strength and the straightness of the keel were fundamental to the shape and the performance of the finished boat. When the keel was laid and its uprights at each end, the stem post and the stern post, were fixed in place, the essential geometry of the boat was established. The planking began from the bottom and worked upward. Each plank, called a strake in boat-building terminology, was fitted to overlap the strake below it by a specific amount, and the overlapping edge was sealed with a material called caulk, which in the Viking period was typically a rope of moss or animal hair tarred with pine pitch to make it waterproof. The planks were held in their overlapping relationship by iron rivets, driven through both planks and clinched on the inside, and the overall structure of the hull was a monocoque, meaning the skin itself was the primary structural element, the strength of the boat coming from the shape and the thickness of the planking rather than from an internal framework. As the planking rose from the keel, the shape of the boat emerged, the gentle curve from the flat bottom to the rising bow and stern, the slight flare of the sides that gave the Viking hull its distinctive and beautiful profile. The boat that was being made had existed in the boat builder's imagination from the beginning of the project. The entire form present in the mind before the first axe stroke fell on the first piece of timber, and the building was the process of making the physical object match the mental one, each plank and each rivet bringing the boat into existence from the raw material that had been waiting in the forest. When the planking was complete and the ribs had been fitted inside the hull to stiffen it and to provide the attachment points for the thwarts, which were the seats where the oarsmen would sit, and when the mast step and the mast partner and all the other fittings had been installed, the boat was finished, or nearly so. The final preparation involved tarring the hull below the waterline with pine pitch to waterproof it, and to prevent the wood from absorbing water, which would make it heavy and liable to rot. The application of the pitch was done with a brush and with heat. The pitch warmed until it was fluid enough to flow into the grain of the wood and seal it, the builder working along the hull in sections, coating every surface that would be in contact with the water. The launching of the completed boat was an occasion for the community, the product of months of skilled work being committed to the element it was made for, slid down into the water on a greased slip, settling into its natural medium with a grace that justified all the labour and skill that had produced it. The builder would stand on the shore and watch the boat float, watching the waterline and the attitude of the hull, reading the behaviour of the boat in the water as a final check of the work, looking for any sign that something was not as it should be. In a well-built boat, nothing would be wrong. The hull would sit level, the bow and the stern at the right heights, the waterline running where it was supposed to run, the whole thing looking in the water as it had looked in the builder's imagination before the first stroke of the axe. Chapter 17. The Seasons of Fishing. We have discussed fishing already, but the seasons of fishing deserve their own treatment because the seasonal pattern of the Viking fisherman's year was as structured and as defining as the seasonal pattern of the farmer's year, and the two overlapped and interacted in ways that made the whole a single coherent rhythm rather than two separate ones. The spring fishing began when the ice broke, which in the fjords and the harbours of Scandinavia happened at different times in different years, and which was one of the most eagerly anticipated events of the late winter. The fishermen who had been confined to short trips or to no fishing at all through the worst of the winter would begin checking the ice in the early days of March, watching for the signs of thaw, the slight darkening of the ice that indicated it was becoming porous, the small pools of water on the surface, the first thin cracks appearing along the shore. When the ice was gone and the water was open, the boats went out. Spring was also the season of the herring run. Herring moved inshore in spring in enormous shoals, and the coastal communities that had access to these runs could take very large quantities of fish in a very short time. The entire fishing capacity of the village would be deployed during the herring run, every boat out and every net available set, and the catch would be brought to shore and processed immediately. The women and the older children and anyone else who could work handling the split and salt and hang of the fish, while the boats went out again for another load. The herring run lasted only a few weeks, and everything that could be done in those weeks was done, because the salted herring would be food for months, and the opportunity came only once a year. Summer fishing was conducted in better weather and with less urgency than the spring run, the boats going out on the longer days for the fish that were available in the warmer months, the catches smaller but more consistent, providing fresh food for daily consumption with a surplus for smoking and drying. The summer fisherman had a more comfortable life than the spring or autumn one. The seas calmer and the days long, and the work of fishing in good weather having a quality of pleasure alongside its purpose that the harder seasons could not provide. Autumn brought the cod, which was the most important fish for long-term preservation. Cod caught in autumn and dried through the winter produced stockfish, which was the staple dried fish of the Norse diet and the primary fish export of the Norse world. The drying was done on wooden racks set in exposed positions to maximize the airflow over the split fish, and the slow drying process over the cold months of autumn and winter produced a product of remarkable durability that would keep for years without refrigeration, and that provided protein and nutrition through the months when fresh food was scarce. The production of stockfish was not merely a domestic activity but a commercial one, and the Norse trade in stockfish with the rest of Europe became over subsequent centuries one of the most significant commodity trades of the medieval world. Winter fishing was done by those who were willing to brave the cold and the short days for the fish that could be caught close to shore through the ice or from small boats in the protected waters of the fjords. Winter fishing was not comfortable, the cold water and the wind and the short daylight limiting both the time available and the energy available, but it provided fresh fish in a season when the diet could become monotonous, and the preserved fish of the stores could use the supplement of something caught that morning and cooked that evening. Chapter 18. The Tools of Daily Life. The tools that Viking people used in their daily lives were made with care and used with respect, because in a world where everything had to be made by hand from raw materials, tools were both valuable and necessary. And a tool that was well made and well maintained was the difference between work being possible and work being extremely difficult. The tools of the Viking household were kept sharp and clean and in good repair, and the knowledge of how to maintain them was part of the basic competence expected of every member of the household. The knife was the most universal of tools, used by every member of the household for everything from the preparation of food to the cutting of leather to the trimming of timber. Every adult wore a knife, sheathed at the belt, always available, because a knife that was not immediately to hand was a knife that was not serving its purpose. The Viking knife was typically a single-edged blade with a wooden handle, simple in design and highly functional, and the sharpening of knives was a daily task done with a whetstone, the blade drawn across the stone at a consistent angle in smooth, controlled strokes until the edge was sharp enough to cut cleanly without dragging. The axe was also a universal tool, used for felling trees and splitting wood and rough shaping of timber and many other tasks that required a heavier edge than the knife could provide. The Viking axe ranged from small hand axes used for close work to large felling axes used for bringing down trees, and the different types had their different shapes and weights adapted to their particular uses. The axe was also a weapon, and the Norse relationship with the axe as both tool and weapon was a practical one without the sharp distinction that modern people might draw between the two. The spade and the digging stick and the ard, which was a simple ploughing tool drawn by an animal, were the tools of the farming work, and their maintenance was the maintenance of an edge and a straight handle, and a strong joint between the two. The ard was the simplest form of plough, a pointed stick drawn through the soil to break it up rather than to turn it over in the way that the heavier moldboard plough did, and it was adequate for the lighter soils of many Scandinavian farming areas, even if it was less effective than later ploughing technology. The fishing tools, the nets and the lines and the hooks and the weights were in constant need of maintenance because the sea and the work wore them continuously. Nets torn by the catch or by the seabed needed to be repaired promptly, because a net with unrepaired tiers caught fewer fish and was liable to lose what it had caught. The repair of nets was done in the quiet moments of the day, and in the evenings, the netmaker's fingers working through the familiar knotting sequence, each knot precisely the same as the one before, the repair growing under the hands as the conversation of the evening continued around it. The wooden bowls and the spoons and the cups of the household were turned on a lathe, or carved by hand, simple in form but smoothly finished, the surfaces worn to a patina by years of use and washing. The largest bowls served for preparing food and for serving at table. The smaller ones were individual eating bowls. The cups were used for ale and for water and for whatever else the household drank. Each piece was a small object of skilled workmanship, made for use and surviving by being used well and maintained carefully, the cracks oiled and the surfaces scraped clean, the whole being replaced only when it was too worn or too damaged to serve any longer. Chapter 19. The Sounds of the Village. We spent some time in the story about the monastery thinking about the sounds of that particular place, and it seems right to do the same for the Viking village, because the sounds of the village were as specific and as character defining as any of its visible or material qualities, and thinking about them carefully is a pleasant and settling occupation. The most constant sound of a coastal Viking village was the sea. The sea was always there, its voice varying from the barely audible wash of a calm day to the much louder sound of waves on the shore in a swell or a storm, but never entirely absent. The people of the village heard the sea from the moment they woke until the moment they slept, and they heard it in their sleep as well, the rhythm of the water against the shore providing a background to the night that was as natural and as unremarkable as the sound of their own breathing. The sea told them things. A change in the sound of the waves before dawn might tell an experienced person that the wind was building or shifting, that the day's fishing would need to be adjusted, that the weather was changing in a particular direction. The sounds of the animals were the next most constant. The cattle in the barn were audible through the longhouse wall, the low sounds of large animals moving in their stalls, eating, settling. The sheep were louder when they needed anything and quieter when they were content. The dogs moved between the buildings and announced the arrival of visitors or of anything they considered worth announcing, which in dogs is a broad category. The horses were audible in their paddock. All of these animal sounds were part of the village's acoustic character, and they were interpreted by the people who heard them in the constant low-level way that people interpret the familiar sounds of their environment, not consciously most of the time, but ready to notice when something was different. The sounds of work were the structured sounds of the village, the rhythmic sounds that marked different activities and different parts of the day. The smith's hammer in the morning, the grinding of the quern when flour was being made, the thud of the weaver's beater as the cloth advanced row by row, the sound of axes in the forest when there was timber to be felled or split, the sound of boats being launched or hauled up, the sound of nets being mended on the shore. Each sound placed for anyone who could hear it, the activity it represented in time and in space, giving an acoustic map of the day's work that was always available to anyone paying attention. The sounds of the evening were different from the sounds of the day in the way that evening sounds always differ, quieter and more domestic, the work sounds having ceased and the social sounds having taken their place. The voices of people talking in the longhouse, the occasional burst of laughter, the sound of a string being plucked on a lyre or a flute being played, the murmuring of the storyteller and the silence of the audience attending. These were the sounds that the village retired on, the sounds that were the background of the transition from wakefulness to sleep, these sounds that became part of sleep itself, heard but not registered, present but not intrusive. And then the deep sounds of the night, which were not the sounds of human activity at all, but the sounds of the world continuing on its own, the sea and the wind and the small sounds of the building and the animals, the sounds that had been present since long before the village existed and that would be present long after, the sounds that any particular village was simply a brief interruption in, few generations of human noise between the undisturbed soundscape of before and the undisturbed soundscape of after. Those sounds are very old. They are still being made somewhere, and you're at the presence of your own version of them, the night sounds of your particular place, these sounds that are the background of sleep, familiar enough to be reassuring, steady enough to be restful, old enough to carry in them something of all the nights that have ever been. Listen to them, let them carry you. Chapter 20. What the village knew. A Viking village, like any small community in any period, contained a great deal of knowledge, and the particular character of that knowledge is worth thinking about, because it was different from the knowledge that most people in the modern world have access to, and the difference is instructive in a way that is relevant to the experience of rest. The knowledge of the Viking village was embodied knowledge, knowledge that lived in the hands and the eyes and the body, rather than in books or in formal instruction. The woman who spun wool knew spinning the way her hands knew it, which is a different kind of knowing from reading about spinning. The smith who worked iron knew the colour and the feel of hot iron in a way that no description can fully convey. The fisherman who read the sea knew the sea in their body, in the balance of their feet in the moving boat, and the feeling of the wind on their face and the look of the water that told them something that could not be put into words, but that was perfectly clear and perfectly reliable. This embodied knowledge was not inferior to book knowledge. It was different, and for the purposes of the Viking village it was more useful, because the village needed knowledge that could be applied directly to the materials of the world, and embodied knowledge was exactly that kind. The person who knew spinning or iron working or boat building in their hands and eyes could do the work, which was what was needed. The person who knew it only in theory could not. The knowledge of the village was also relational, meaning it was knowledge about the specific landscape and the specific conditions of the specific place. The farmer who had farmed the same fields for 30 years knew those fields in a way that no newcomer could know them, knew which corner drained badly, and which corner was most sheltered, and which patch of ground produced the heaviest grain, and which needed more manure. The fisherman who had fished the same stretch of coast for 30 years knew it in the same way, knew where the shoals ran, and where the currents were, and what the water looked like when the weather was changing in a particular direction. This relational knowledge of a particular place accumulated over a long time, is a kind of knowledge that is very specific and very reliable within its domain, and that is not easily transferred to other places or other conditions. The Viking farmer who knew their own fields perfectly was not thereby qualified to farm unknown land with the same confidence, because the knowledge that made them competent on their own land was precisely the knowledge of that land's particular character, which was not transferable. This is one of the reasons that stability, staying in one place, was valued in Viking society, as in the monastic society we discussed in the previous story. Staying in one place was the condition that made the accumulation of this relational knowledge possible. And now, having accumulated a certain amount of knowledge of our own about the Viking village and its daily life, we are approaching the end of the evening and the beginning of the sleep, and the knowledge we have gathered settles into the mind in the way that any knowledge settles, quietly and without fanfare. becoming part of what we know in the same way that the smith's knowledge of hot iron became part of the smith, not a separate thing held in a separate part of the mind, but simply available, part of the background of knowing. The village is sleeping, the fire is banked, the sea is making its sound, the knowledge of the village, all of it, the fishing and the smithing and the weaving and the boat building and the farming and the cooking and the storytelling and the laughter and the silence, all of it is resting now. The day's application of it done, the night's non-use of it begun. And you are resting too. The knowledge of the day, whatever it was, is resting. The work of the day is done. The fire of your own evening is banked. Good night. Final reflections. The long patience of ordinary life. For those who are still present, which by this point in the evening is a smaller number than it was at the beginning, here are some final thoughts on the Viking village and on what its ordinary life suggests about ordinary life in general. The Viking village was not a place of constant drama. The dramatic events, the departures and the returns of the ships, the raids and the trading voyages, the assemblies at which disputes were settled and laws were made, these happened occasionally and were important and memorable. But they were not the texture of daily life. The texture of daily life was the things we have been describing, the morning fire and the morning porridge, and the animals and the fishing and the textile work and the smithing and the meals and the evenings and the sleep. These things happened every day, and their happening every day was the actual content of a life, the substance of which the dramatic moments were only occasional interruptions. This is true of all lives, not only Viking ones. The substance of any life is its ordinary days, the days that are approximately like the day before and approximately like the day after, the days that do not make memorable stories, but that constitute the actual experience of being alive in a particular time and a particular place. The dramatic days are the exception. The ordinary days are the rule. And there is something about the ordinary days that is not diminished by their ordinariness. The Viking farmer who got up and lit the fire and fed the animals and went to the field and came back and ate and talked and went to sleep was having an experience that was complete in itself, not a lesser experience for being undramatic, not a preparation for something better that was coming. The fire was warm, the food was satisfying, the work was purposeful, the company was familiar, the sleep at the end was deep. These are not small things. They are in fact the main things. The warmth of the fire, the satisfaction of work, the companionship of the familiar, the deep sleep at the end of the day. You are in the presence of the last of these. The warmth is wherever it is around you. The work of the day is done. The familiar is everything that is this room, and this night, and this moment. And the sleep is very close now, closer than it was at the beginning of this story, closer than it was a few chapters ago, moving toward you in the way that sleep moves, not dramatically, not suddenly, just gradually and persistently, in the direction of rest. Let it come. The Viking village is sleeping. The longhouse fire is breathing. The sea is making its ancient sound on the ancient shore. And you are sleeping, or nearly sleeping, or in the particular stillness that is so close to sleep that the difference is only a matter of moments, and the moments are passing. Good night. The fire breathes. The sea turns, the night holds everything in it. Sleep. extended reflections on the Viking relationship with winter. For those still with us, here are some additional thoughts on the Viking winter, because the winter was the longest and most defining of the seasons, and there is more to say about it than we have already said. The Norse had a rich vocabulary for different qualities of darkness and different qualities of cold, which tells us something about how central these experiences were to their world. There were words for different kinds of snow, words for different qualities of frost, words for the different sounds the ice made, words for the particular quality of the light on clear winter days when the sun was very low on the horizon and the shadows were very long and the light had a particular thin clarity that was quite different from summer light. The development of this vocabulary was the development of the instruments needed to think precisely about the most important conditions of life in a particular place. The same way that any environment that is experienced intensely produces the vocabulary needed to describe it accurately. The preparation for winter began in late summer and continued through autumn, and the whole household was oriented toward the approaching cold from the moment the days began to shorten perceptibly after midsummer. The firewood needed to be cut and stacked in the quantity that the winter required, which was a great deal of wood, enough to keep the longhouse fire going through months of cold. The stacking of wood was done systematically, the logs split to the right size for the hearth and stacked in rows to dry, the stack covered with bark or turf to keep the rain off, the whole pile measured by experience against the months ahead. The preservation of food, which we have already described in some detail, was the other great preoccupation of the pre-winter period, and it overlapped in October and November with the wood cutting and the preparation of the building for the cold. The building itself needed to be checked, and any gaps in the walls or the roof sealed, because a long house that was not properly sealed against the wind lost heat in a way that made the entire winter more difficult and more fuel-intensive. The checking and sealing of the building was systematic, starting at the roof line and working down, looking for the places where daylight showed through or where the fingers could feel cold air coming in, and filling them with moss or with daub or with whatever material was available and appropriate. The shortening of the days was experienced as a genuine loss, each evening coming a little sooner and each morning coming a little later, and the Norse responded to this loss not with resignation but with active management, extending the usable hours of the day with fire and with lamps. The oil lamp, which burned animal fat or oil in a shallow stone or clay dish with a wick of moss or twisted plant fibre, was the primary source of artificial light, and the management of the lamp oil through the winter was another of the household's rationing challenges, the oil that was available needing to last through the months when light was most needed. The lamps were not very bright by modern standards, giving a warm yellowish light that was adequate for close work but not for distance vision, and the longhouse in the evenings of deep winter was a warm and rather dim place, the faces around the fire illuminated by its shifting light, while the corners of the building remained in shadow. The midwinter festival, called Yule or Jol in the Norse tradition, was the great celebration of the darkest period, a multi-day feast involving the slaughter of animals and the consumption of quantities of food and drink that were considerably greater than on ordinary days. The Yule feast was partly a religious occasion, associated with the gods and with the fertility of the coming year, and partly simply a response to the fact that midwinter was a point in the year when the community needed something to celebrate, when the darkness was at its greatest and the promise of the return of the light was most needed. The feasting and the drinking and the gathering of the community around the fires of Yule was an assertion of warmth and life and human solidarity against the cold and the dark outside, and it was taken seriously and participated in with genuine enthusiasm. After Yule, the worst of the winter remained, but the days had stopped shortening and would slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, begin to lengthen again, and the Norse were attentive to this change. The first perceptible lengthening of the days was noted and remarked on, and the gradual increase in the light through February and March was followed with the kind of attention that a person gives to something they have been waiting for, something whose coming they want to catch in the moment of its arriving, rather than to notice only after it has become obvious. Spring, when it came, was received as the thing it actually was. The return of the world to usefulness and light after the long darkness of winter, the release from the indoor confinement that the cold had imposed, the beginning again of the outdoor work that was the primary economic activity and the primary source of the food and the fuel that the winter had consumed. The Norse spring was not merely a season change but a kind of rescue, and the gratitude with which it was received was proportionate to the actual difficulty of what it was releasing people from. And now it is late, and the winter is somewhere else, and the dark you're in is the mild, managed dark of a heated room, with a ceiling above it and walls on all four sides, and a morning that is a certain number of hours away, but that will come, as spring came in the Norse world, as reliably and as welcomely as it always has. The dark is not the Viking dark. The cold is not the Viking cold. The night is shorter, the morning is closer, and the sleep is here, very close, the warmth of it all around you, the weight of it settling over you like the weight of the best kind of blanket, gentle and complete. Let it settle. The Viking village has been sleeping for 1,000 years and more since long before this night, and will be sleeping when this night is done, in the ground that holds its hearths and its tools and its lost objects and its bones, the whole accumulated physical record of its existence laid in the earth that is the oldest and the most patient of all possible archives. You are sleeping now, or nearly, or in the place that is so close to sleep that the words for it and the words for sleep are almost the same word. Rest there. Good night. The fire breathes, the sea turns, everything is as it was and as it will be. Sleep. One more chapter. The things that remain. There is something worth saying about what remains of the Viking village, because what remains is a different kind of evidence from the written records and the sagas and the legends, and thinking about it brings the everyday life we have been describing into a particular focus. The Viking village leaves archaeological traces, objects and structures pressed into the earth, surviving in the particular way that things survive when they are buried and left undisturbed. The hearths are the most consistent trace, the central fires of the longhouses leaving carbon and ash, and the burned and reddened stones that surrounded them, a circular darkness in the soil that marks where the fire was. When archaeologists find these hearths, they find the centre of the building and the centre of the life that the building contained. The place where the family gathered and the food was cooked and the stories were told and the evenings were spent. Around the hearths are the objects that were lost or discarded or deliberately placed in the ground, the detritus of daily life that accumulated over years and decades, and that the earth preserved with the indifferent thoroughness of a very patient archivist. The small items that fell through the floorboards or into the earth floor and were never retrieved, the broken tools that were thrown away, the remains, the animal bones and the fish bones and the seeds and the nutshells and the fruit stones, each one a record of a meal that was eaten in a particular place in a particular season. The quern stones, worn smooth by years of grinding, the loom weights, the little clay rings that held the warp threads under tension on the warp-weighted loom, the comb teeth, the fragments of boxes, the bone needles, the iron nails, the small personal items that were dropped or lost and that spent 1,000 years in the ground waiting for someone to find them. Each of these objects was held in a human hand on a particular day in the Viking period, was part of someone's ordinary life, was the tool of work or the item of daily use that the person who held it thought of without particular feeling because it was simply one of the objects of their life, no more remarkable than any other. The quern stone that ground the grain was not remarkable to the person who ground it. The loom weight that kept the thread under tension was not remarkable to the person who wove with it. They were simply the equipment of daily life, as unremarkable and as necessary as the equivalent equipment in your own daily life. And now they are remarkable, because they are old, and because they are the physical evidence of a life that has otherwise vanished, the material residue of people who left no other record. They tell us things that the sagas do not tell us. The size of the fish that was eaten on a particular evening, the quality of the grain that was ground, the texture of the cloth that was woven on a particular loom. They tell us the small things, the everyday things, the things that nobody thought to write down because they were simply the conditions of life. And what they tell us, taken together, is that the life was ordinary, that the people who lived it got up in the morning and lit the fire and fed the animals and did their work and ate their meals and talked and slept, that the material equipment of their lives was well made and practical and used until it wore out, that the food they ate was simple and varied by season, that the work they did was skilled and continuous, that the life was organized around the same fundamental requirements that organize all human life: warmth and food and shelter and companionship and work and rest. You share all of these requirements with the people who dropped the quernstone into the earth floor 1,000 years ago. You share the need for warmth, which you have, the need for food, which you have had today, the need for shelter, which is all around you, the need for companionship, which is in your life in whatever form it takes, the need for work, which your day has contained, and the need for rest, which is what this story has been building toward, slowly and without urgency, through all the chapters of the Viking village and its ordinary life. The rest is here. The objects are in the earth, quiet and still, having done their work. The village is in the earth, having held its life. And you're in your bed, having held your day, and the rest is here, and the sleep is here, and the night is here, warm and dark and quiet, exactly as it should be. Let everything settle. The quernstone is still, the loom weight is still, the hearth is cold and dark and silent in the earth, exactly as it was found, and you are still and warm, and the sleep has you now, or very nearly, and the very nearly is close enough that I will stop talking and let the rest of it happen on its own. Good night. The Viking village is sleeping. You are sleeping. The night holds everything. Sleep well. The sea is making its sound on the ancient shore. The fire has been breathing in the earth for 1,000 years. Cold now, long cold, its heat dispersed into the ground that held it. The village is where it was, invisible now, its life folded into the soil, its people gone into the same earth, the whole thing resting in the long patience of the ground. And you are resting too, in the short patience of this night, which will hold you until morning. The morning will come, the light will return. The longhouse fire will not be relit, but your own day will begin again, as days always begin again, after the rest that makes beginning possible. Sleep now, everything is still, the night endures. Good night. The silence is complete, the dark is complete, sleep is complete. Good night. The longhouse stands in memory and in the ground. The hearth is cold, the loom is still, the smith has laid down the hammer. The fishermen have pulled up the boats. The animals are quiet. The children are sleeping. The stories are finished for tonight. Everything that needed to be done has been done. Everything that needed to be said has been said. The rest is silence and warmth, and the dark and the breathing and the slow turning of the night toward morning. Sleep. Good night.